Okay, I'm going to talk about the exam briefly. If you have issues about the exam, you'll ask me now. After now, I'm not interested. Okay, the exam that you know is on Wednesday. It's in the same rooms as it previously was. By the way, the third and fourth exams are not in those rooms. They're in some other room. I can't remember where, but I'll post it. From 6:10 to 7:10, as you know, on Wednesday. An lecture will follow from like 7:30 to 8:30. The exam covers from the equation approach to buyer share and seller share. That is, you have to be able to see when I give you a tax, what the new price in equilibrium will be, and to determine the buyer share, the seller share, the seller's price, the tax from the government, the whatever I want to ask, the producer surplus, the change in consumer surplus, all this kind of stuff, right? So some sort of equation thing, but having to do with buyer share, seller share. Starting there, all the way through marginal product, average product, marginal cost, average cost, etc., all that cost stuff, to short run and long run equilibrium. Nothing on, and of course, we did derivation of demand in between that. We did normal derivation of demand, we did consumer equilibrium, you'll see some examples, derivation of demand, but not income and substitution effect. Not the income and substitution effect because we didn't discuss it. So the last couple of pages of my demand notes completely ignore it, but you will have to derive various types of demand functions. And insofar as the income and substitution effect is, you have to know why it would be interesting. Not how to do it, but why it would be interesting. Why we would care about distinguishing between the income and substitution effects. I talked to you about that in class. It's probably in my notes. And then that's basically it. Any questions? Now, I would take advantage of the TAs, particularly Lisa, who's a very good TA. As I said, she actually taught this course last year when one of the profs had to go somewhere. She taught the second half of the course. She's very good at micro. And unless Young is doing it, then he's really excellent. Our next TA, who's either started already, I'm not sure if he has, I don't think so. He's a really excellent TA, really overdoes it actually, so I would strongly recommend you should take advantage of these TAs. You hardly ever get a better batch of them. So then, and so far as I'm concerned, you can see me tomorrow for any questions you have in Sid Smith 21116 from 5 to 6, but on Wednesday, I'm not going to be here because I have to be over at the exam, or I'm not going to bother coming. So, really your last chance to talk to me is tomorrow between 5 and 6. And you can send me emails if they're well articulated. You know, don't ask me to explain the course to you, for example, which some people do. They say, hey, yo, I don't understand demand. Can you explain this to me? I did. I wrote a whole 100 pages on it. You've got it in the notes. Read it. Any questions on the exam? So that's it. We're not going to be interested in the exam at this point. Yeah. Yeah, but we only did it in the diagram. This is equations. I want you to be able to look at equations and confirm that understanding. Probably I, more than other sections of this course, really stress equations so you recognize what can be done for the person who could actually calculate demand functions in the real world and cost functions in the real world, which a person could do. All this theoretical thing would be useless unless we could do that. Okay. So now we're going to talk about Monopoly. Monopoly is flat out interesting, extraordinary. It takes us, by the end of today, I want you to focus completely not only on the concept of Monopoly for the next few hours, and then of course forget it until after the exam. Monopoly is actually a pretty straightforward subject, and you're going to see we actually know everything we need to know about Monopoly already. But there's a few things I need to clarify. First of all, in the history of at least European economics, the whole history of discussion of economics and European economic thought, monopoly is probably the dominant idea and the first idea. That's the first idea people have about markets, is that in some markets, prices are affected because someone is monopolizing, i.e. someone is manipulating the price through some control over the commodity, its output or whatever, right? So, there's not a lot of real analysis. For example, we get to Adam Smith in 1776, and he doesn't have much more to say about it than the monopoly charges the highest price that they can, which turns out to be completely false. But he just kind of misspoke himself, he means something else. Because what the monopoly does is charge the highest price that they can to maximize profit, right? So a monopoly is simply the phenomenon where a single firm totally determines the output of an industry. No other firm does so. They're the only one who does so. So, in fact, one of the interesting things about Smith, when he does talk about monopoly, and this is an important idea, competition is for bozos. In our world, we talk about, the competitive market, how wonderful it is. But if you're in business, you're not interested in competition. Competition means you get the same profit as everybody else. Big deal, right? In business, that's what we always talk about in these various ways, you're trying to maximize the profit. And indeed, as Adam Smith points out, if we believe that firms maximize profit, the natural circumstance is monopoly, not competition. Competition is weird. Why should we be competing? He actually says, this is in 1776, the brewer, the baker, and something, or I can't remember the third one, never get together, but they conspire to defraud the public. So in all business, you want to be a monopoly. I remember in the book, The Godfather, I mean, you all know this, the movie presumably, there's a page where the Godfather goes, the Godfather made an important economic understanding, monopoly. So he's controlling the Genco olive oil, which is the name of his olive oil company, Genco olive oil, and he just kills everybody, right? But he gets a monopoly. If you have a monopoly, you can charge whatever price you want to maximize profit. And you get more than the average rate of profit, right? So in your lives, if you're in business, you want to be a monopoly. Not a legal monopoly, but a legal monopoly. So monopoly is a firm that is the only firm producing. 4 ways this can happen. All this is in my notes, and we're going to ultimately cut to the chase in about 15 minutes. I just kick into gear with a small bit of information. But this is the broad thing. I'll give you an example. The problem with the monopoly is they have an above average profit. If they have an above average profit, everybody wants to be in that industry. So for example, in the dot-com boom of the 1990s, every idiot who didn't even know how to operate a computer had an IPO, which is like a kind of set up business, claiming to be doing something with the internet. Everybody did that because there was huge money to be made, right? That meant that the monopolies that previously existed just disappeared because everybody got in there. One of the stories that I kind of like, the guy, Richard Arkwright, really was the first person to have a modern factory. He ripped off the idea of the cotton, it wasn't the cotton jetting, it was the spinning frame, I think it was, from some other inventor, just basically took it from him, from peanuts, and set up this incredibly efficient factory. Nobody else had it. And he was able to produce cheaper than everybody else, so he made a huge amount of money, but the guy was a real jerk. But he suffered in his life. Because the problem with that is, you cannot charge a higher price than everybody else and make a greater profit than everybody else, because they will want to enter your industry. So this guy, here was his punishment from who knows what, his punishment was earth. He had to travel around Britain all the rest of his life in a carriage. Now, we know from, this is, you see these in the movies, the nice ladies in their hats riding around in carriages. No. The roads of Britain in like the 1770s were awful. They were just awful. Rocks, huge holes. They were just completely broken up. Carriages destroyed them. They were just made out of dirt. So basically, for a person to go 1 mile in a carriage, there's no shock absorbers, pulled by a horse, excruciating. Just completely rattled to death. This guy had to go all over Britain, every day of the year. He was just rattled to death for his sin of ripping off somebody else. But that's the idea. If you get a great idea to make money, everyone's dog is going to come in there, right? So the key with monopoly is prevent entry. Somehow people can't enter. 4 ways. One is a government monopoly, which says nobody can enter. We have those today, like the LCBO, for example, or Ontario Hydro used to be a government monopoly. Now these monopolies operate slightly different than the old style monopolies in the 17th century, where the East India Company was a monopoly. Hudson's Bay Company was a monopoly. They were granted a monopoly and they made huge profits. The LCBO doesn't. But a government monopoly, the 401 is in a sense a monopoly. The 407 is flat out a monopoly because the government says it's a monopoly even though it's privately owned. Da-da-da-da. Government monopoly. We'll talk about that subsequently. Whether the government should have a monopoly or not a monopoly. Then the second way, which is sort of more common, and this way bedeviled people for years, because anybody who talked about economics hated monopolies. Monopolies charge higher prices than competition by producing less. That's the key to monopolies in general. They charge a higher price by producing less. And that's the way people treated monopolies up until Marshall in 1890, which we'll get to subsequently. So basically, in almost all the literature of monopolies, even to the present day, monopolies are awful. They charge a higher price by producing less. They're the worst possible things. We want to get rid of monopolies. But the trouble is they can exist because a firm has the only output of something. For example, De Beers for years produced like 60–70% of all the diamonds in the world and all the cheap diamonds. So they could basically control the price. Inco in Sudbury controlled 90% of all the nickel in the world. In Europe, the standard example is, in the text, in the books before like 1800, is a water, a spring. Whoever owns the spring controls, access to the spring. So you can own a specific output, some kind of thing, flat out, because you own the mine, you own the land, whatever it is. Or you could own some specific process, right? Some process. I don't know if you guys know from Les Miserables, Jean Valjean, actually when he's in jail, learns the process to produce, in English it says boot black, I'm not quite sure, I looked at the French, but boot black, but it says he had this process that he alone knew how to do, right? Many, many instances. Patents, for example, drugs. If they hold the patent, they're the only one who knows how to do that, they're the only one allowed to do it. You could have a monopoly on an industrial technique. So for example, at one point the Japanese had a monopoly in first, what is it, like, how first in, last out, whatever it is, or very minimizing inventories. So they made huge profits. But that's hard to, limit other people from doing it. So monopolies of a certain type control output or input absolutely, right? Now this monopoly is the monopoly we don't like, because in every single one of those cases, they restrict output and they increase price. So we'll see subsequently, almost all of economic analysis tries to prove that such other monopolies are wrong. In fact, Smith argues, his main point is these monopolies are wrong, competition is best, and we'll get to that after the break. Then there's a third type of monopoly. So when we start analyzing, I'll be analyzing this monopoly first. And this monopoly I just talked about is the dominant monopoly in the world. Most of the monopolies in the world are like that. Then Marshall discovered another type of monopoly, a most interesting type of monopoly, which is called the natural monopoly. Now the reason the natural monopoly is a monopoly is because it is so big, the optimal size of the firm. Remember we talked about the optimal size of the firm when we talked about long run. The optimal size of the firm is big enough to supply the whole industry at a falling price. So for example, in Canada, Indigo is a natural monopoly in booksellers. There's no room for a company that size in Canada. There was another, Chapters, but Indigo took it over because there wasn't room for two that size. It is a monopoly. There's only one bookseller in Canada that can produce as cheaply as Indigo. No other, right? There's no other. In the States, because it's a bigger market, there's a number of types of indigo, but not that many. Sometimes a power plant or nuclear power plants oftentimes are local monopolies in the United States because they're huge and expensive. Buffalo, for example, has monopoly power. Most of New York State, the power companies are monopoly powers. And until 20 years ago, almost all electricity generation in the U.S. was monopolization, monopoly power, monopoly. In Ontario, the first generation of electricity, which happened in early 1890, actually not. Before 1890, you could generate electricity, you simply couldn't transmit it. But with the discovery like the AC-DC current with Edison, you can transmit electricity by about 1890, and you get the first big electricity generators and everything else, right? Electricity that everybody can use. Where was the first electricity generated in Ontario? Well, you should all know the answer. How would electricity be generated in 1896? How was power generated? The Romans had this, by the way. In 1542, how was power generated to run, a grain mill, for example?
By water power.
By water power. So where do you think the first hydroelectricity generation was? Niagara Falls. Now, if you think about this, in southern Ontario, there's no other place that generates that kind of power. There's no other river that's that has any kind of speed at all. The next closest is Sault Ste. Marie. So in Quebec, you've got a lot of swift-flowing rivers. So they've got like a number of different, in their history, competing power companies early on. We only have one. And this one made so much money already by 1905 that the main player in it, built the biggest house in Toronto. And what is that house? What is the biggest house in Toronto? Flat Castle. So that shows you how much money he made. And then the Ontario government said enough of this. Not because they were socialists, because this guy and his cronies were charging all the manufacturers of Ontario high prices. And the manufacturers said, hey, wait a minute, we're not going to pay this guy all this money. Take over the power generation in Niagara Falls, and from then on, we have Ontario Hydro generating power as cheaply as it can, we'll talk about that later, to provide cheap power for manufacturing in Ontario, right? Okay, good. So that's an example of a natural monopoly, right? It doesn't dominate because, in that case, it was also because it was the only source. But usually it's because it's so big. Walmart, for example, in most towns, is a natural monopoly. Nobody can compete with it. It doesn't matter. Like, you can go in there and say, we don't like Walmart. Okay, good. See if you can sell goods cheaper than that. Can't do it, right? So they're natural monopolies because they produce cheaper than everybody else. Now, the interesting thing about a natural monopoly is, as Marshall saw, and this is fundamental to us and a huge insight, most economists realize this but don't use it a lot, is this. Natural monopolies can oftentimes produce cheaper than competition. They produce cheaper and more output. And we'll see that when we get to a discussion of the whole theory of welfare in society and the optimal allocation, the Pareto analysis and most of modern economics can't analyze this monopoly. The whole theory breaks down with this monopoly. So that's called the natural monopoly. Now we're going to have three cases of the natural monopoly. The 401 is a natural monopoly, for example. Three cases of this natural monopoly where but even though it's not as common as the other type of monopoly, that is, that which controls output or input or something like that. And then, fourthly, we have what's called a cartel, such as OPEC is. And that's where industry has actually got a number of potentially competitive firms, but being smart, they band together and they produce like a monopoly, which means they make an extra profit. Now, in the sort of English tradition, Canada, Britain, the United States, such cartels are illegal, but in the Japanese-German tradition, they are not, which is kind of interesting. So we'll talk about cartels subsequently. Everybody? Okay, monopoly, single producer. All right, now then, our next step is this. We need to find out what is the profit maximizing formula for monopoly. And it turns out everybody in this room knows the profit maximizing formula for the monopoly. What is that? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that, of course, is the same profit maximizing formula for a competitive firm, but a competitive firm, marginal revenue is constant. Because as I say, when we look at a downward sloping demand function, marginal revenue is not constant. But if a demand function is horizontal, which it is for a competitive firm, their individual demand functions are constant because they're price takers. They can produce whatever they want at the same price. For them, marginal revenue is constant. But the monopolist is the only firm in the industry. So if it produces more, price goes down. But by the same token, if it produces less, price goes up. All right? So what we need to do to make our step is understand what marginal revenue is. When we understand that, we just go through. Okay? Our cost function analysis is exactly the same. Monopolies are like any other firm, except that there's one kind of exception. The natural monopoly is so big that marginal costs can typically be, or very often be, constant. You know, it's that big. But not so true for other smaller firms. All right, so let's just see here what we've got. Here, I'm going to do this. On this, we have cost per unit here. Since the monopoly is the only firm in the industry, we're going to draw, first of all, I'll do this as linear, everybody. Here's a linear demand function. All right, now, there's the demand function in the marketplace. Right here we have the industry. Okay? But it's also the firm. It's also the firm. Because the monopoly is the industry. So we're not going to have a firm and industry diagram. We're going to have the monopoly. Now it turns out, just watch and don't draw this yet. The monopoly, like any other firm, has an average cost function. This could be the average cost function of a monopoly. That could be it, right? It's just stuck there like that. This could be the average cost function of a monopoly. It could be, say, like this, right? Or it could be, say, like this. Or this could be the average cost function of a monopoly. Like this. This would be a natural monopoly. Notice it's all average cost functions. It can be anywhere. Here, the industry is gigantic. Notice, if it was this firm, please don't copy this down. We'll come to this later. You need to see it in general. If this is the average cost of a natural monopoly, you'll see that as this monopoly produces more, its average cost falls. No competitive firm can compete with this stuff. There's only room for one. A natural monopoly has minimum average cost to the right of demand. Whereas the type of monopoly we're going to begin with, drugs, other kind of commodities which are just controlled, its average cost function might be here. Right? Just like that. It just is somewhere, right? Now, so there's the average cost function of the monopoly. And that's the way we're going to start on all our analysis. There's the single firm. I don't need a firm diagram you're looking at. Okay, good. Now we do need the marginal cost function of this firm. And it turns out everyone in this room knows where it is. Where is the marginal cost function of this monopoly? Well, where else would it be? Now this is the thing that's interesting. And this is why I detest any kind of memorization. You all know where it is. It doesn't matter whether that average cost thing is in the moon. When you find an average cost function on the moon, where is the marginal cost function? Where is it? Tell me. I'm just going to go. Okay, you mindless people, pull it together. Where is the marginal cost function? Through the minimum. I thought you knew this. I thought you knew this, right? This is the problem. We do this, you'll draw these diagrams, you'll be perfect on this exam on Wednesday, and then I'll say, where is the marginal cost function? I don't know. Think what you're doing. The marginal cost function, always and forever, there are no exceptions, goes through minimum average cost. Right? There's the marginal cost function. This would be like average variable cost, right? Now this isn't so bad as this. No, normally people won't make this mistake. But again, there's things I've learned over the years and they're almost like laughable. But what they tell you is, people are not thinking. You should understand what a marginal cost, average cost relationship is, and I should never have to mention it again. So what's going to happen in this exam, what happens in many final exams, is I draw, we'll see this as an example of a particular type of firm, one that has a marginal cost function like this. All right, let me just pull this out of here for a moment. And I put this question on many an exam. This is the average cost function here, right here. This is the average cost function. Here's the demand function. Away you go, people. Away you go. Now let's see you draw the marginal cost function. And guess what? No matter how much I pound this out, we'll still have huge amounts of the class cannot figure out where it is. How is that possible? It can only be one place. Where? Where is it? Tell me. Through minimum average cost. Does everybody understand this? Because your butts are going to be burnt when I ask a simple question like this, which I'm totally not in. You know, this is the way it'll always be presented, and you'll always have marginal cost going through minimum average cost. There's a couple of exceptions coming up, but it's still true that marginal cost goes to minimum average cost. You'll see why it's true and not true. So, everybody. Now in this case, the only thing that's a little bit different is we've got this whole range to deal with, right? You can't just draw it like this, because in this case, what about all this, right? So you can draw it like, in this case, we'll come back to this. You could draw it kind of like this, right? And somehow I can read this like that. That could happen. But typically, what's interesting is when you have a really big firm, like for example, almost any big, really big manufacturer of any type, marginal cost is pretty well constant for most of the range. So you can draw it like this. This is another way we'll be drawing it. This could be drawn like this. Like marginal cost is essentially constant until about there, and then it rises.